Thank you so much to the offices of the President and the Provost, and especially to Alice Oldfather for organizing today's event. I'm Julie Novkov, and I'm the Interim Dean of Rockefeller College, and I would like to thank Rockefeller College and the College of Arts and Sciences today for supporting our scholars who are doing research into these vitally important topics. We are very grateful and encouraged to see such a big audience today of people who are willing to take some time to go beyond the headlines with our wonderful guests. This is the first in a series of events that the University at Albany will be hosting to provide all of us with a deeper understanding of the roots of this crisis, what is happening as it evolves rapidly on the ground, and what we can expect in the future. I look forward to learning with all of you. I will introduce each speaker very briefly, but you will be able to find more information about these terrific folks in links that will be placed in the chat. Once our presenters have completed their remarks, we will have time for your questions. I would ask you just to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see a clickable link right there. And once questions are posted, you will have the opportunity to upvote questions that you would particularly like our panelists to address. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Chen, Professor of Political Science, and she will be speaking on the long shadow of Soviet nation building over Russian nationalism. Thank you, Professor.
Hi, everyone. Both Russia and Ukraine used to be parts of the Soviet Union. Today, I'm going to focus on the Soviet nation building experience and how its failure directly contributed to today's Russian nationalism and Russian aggressiveness. This is also something that I addressed in my first book titled The Prospects for Liberal Nationalism in Post-Lenin States, published back in 2006. In that book, I made a prediction that Russian nationalism is likely to be strongly illiberal and has the potential of leading to expansionist policies. Sadly, this prediction has turned true. I don't know how many of you have paid attention to Putin's speech right before the invasion. The invasion is, of course, naked aggression against a sovereign country, but even the worst aggressors need to justify their action in front of a domestic audience. Putin's speech was a direct appeal to Russian nationalism. And despite anti-war protests in Russia, available evidence seems to suggest that many Russians apparently support Russia's so-called special operation. Why is this the case? It would be impossible to fully understand the current state of Russian nationalism and Russian national identity without examining the Soviet nation-building process. The original Marxism predicted a worldwide revolution by workers across nations. It was therefore hostile to nationalism and saw nationalism as a kind of false consciousness used by capitalists to divide workers and obscure worker solidarity. Lenin, however, realized that nation-state was far from disappearing and proposed that communist revolution should selectively utilize the force of nationalism and first establish a socialist state in Russia. During and immediately after the October Revolution, in order to gain support from the new nationalist movements among ethnic minorities in the Tsarist Empire, Lenin insisted that the guarantee of independence for all oppressed national groups feature as a central part of Bolshevik policy. Ultimately, however, Lenin only saw nationalism as a tactical tool, a necessary evil for achieving communist victory. The conflation of Soviet and Russian identities already took place, more or less unintentionally, during the Bolshevik Revolution. First of all, the Communist Party consisted many of members recruited from the urban and industrial centers of the country, and therefore was predominantly Russian, ethnically and culturally. Moreover, the Bolsheviks enjoyed the support from many people who had feelings of Russian nationalism, but had nothing in common with communist ideology, including many Tsarist army officers and Russian expatriates. For these people, Lenin was the best hope for the resurgence of a strong Russia. Finally, during the revolution, communism had been identified with Russian nationalism in many of the borderlands by both Russians and non-Russians, which inspired much of the opposition among the minorities to the Soviet government. To be sure, the Bolshevik leaders' official intention was not to restore the Russian Empire, but to create the world's first worker state. Lenin and his colleagues had little sympathy for nationalist movements unless they could be utilized as a political weapon in revolutionary struggle. For example, the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in 1918, which gave over a third of European Russia to German control, indicated that Lenin was ready to sacrifice national interests to preserve the revolutionary success. To manage the enormous ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity within the Soviet Union, Lenin came up with the federal state system as a temporary solution without realizing that the system would end up becoming entrenched over time, solidifying ethnic boundaries. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why Putin severely criticized Lenin for hurting Russian national interests in his speech, as Lenin, in his view, created all these artificial, quote-unquote, artificial states under federalism, including Ukraine, which obviously was a false claim, as Ukraine has its unique history and culture, throughout the centuries. Upon taking power, Lenin disallowed the actual right to secession and began a lengthy process of assimilation while using territorial autonomy to appease national minorities. This approach remained unchanged under Stalin, who progressively integrated elements of Russian nationalism, Russian language into communist ideology. While suppressing a separate Russian identity, Stalin launched a rigorous and brutal campaign of Russification, in which elements of traditional Russian nationalism were rehabilitated strictly within the communist framework in order to create a new, quote-unquote, Soviet myth, causing deep resentment among many ethnic minorities. So this directly, obviously, led to decades of trauma. In the following decades, many ethnic Russians were encouraged to move to other ethnic republics for the purpose of ethnic dilution. And this ultimately led to many active and frozen conflicts within the post-Soviet space today, including Transnistria in Moldova, the Donbas region in Ukraine, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, which was invaded by Russia in 2008, just to name a few. Soviet leaders after Stalin began to see the need to adopt a more flexible political attitude in order to achieve more effective social control. However, efforts to achieve the final fusion of Soviet nationalities through Russification were renewed toward the end of the Khrushchev era. The next Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, basically followed assimilationist policies aimed at the fusion of nations in a period of mature socialism. This continuity was eventually interrupted by Gorbachev, who was kind of switching between vague promises of institutional reforms and repeated announcements to maintain the current republic boundaries and basic framework of federalism. The Soviet Union soon collapsed afterwards. To sum up, the objective of Soviet nation building was to forge a new Soviet identity defined by communist ideology. And the first step of this merging of nations was to bind Russians, which was the linchpin of the nationalities of the Soviet Union, as closely as possible to the USSR as a whole, since they were to provide a core around which the new Soviet people were to develop. A separate Russian national identity, therefore, was consistently subsumed under the Soviet identity. This Soviet-Russia ideological merger led to the conflation of empire, state, and nation, and therefore blurred the boundaries of ethnic Russianness. The outcome was an almost imperial self-identification among Russians. It's not surprising that at the end of the Gorbachev era, the main representatives of nationalist movements in Russia were not those championing liberal values, but the so-called national patriots who pursued far-right, chauvinistic, and pro-empire positions. So this really complex interplay of Soviet, Russian, communist identity left the Russian national identity in shambles during the Soviet period. Therefore, in the post-communist era, there is a really desperate need to recover and promote a new Russian identity with both communist and the Soviet identity now gone. The sense of resentment among Russian nationalists at the Soviet collapse was further compounded by perceived humiliations during the 1990s, such as economic collapse, NATO's eastward expansion, so on and so forth. Putin capitalized on such sentiments and further cultivated them by posing as the defender of Russian civilization. Consequently, many Russians have supported the regime's efforts to establish dominance in the so-called near abroad. Here note Putin's false claim that Russians and Ukrainians are essentially the same. And that was actually the view shared by many Russians. At the same time, traditional Russian nationalism, with its key symbol being the Orthodox Church, has definitely experienced a strong revival in the society. It was deliberately promoted by the regime as well. Note one of the justifications of invasion provided by Putin was Ukraine's alleged oppression of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. During this so-called special operation, you see various leaders of Orthodox Church also came out in support of the invasion. The top leadership, including Putin himself, has been relying on chauvinistic nationalist rhetoric to appeal to the population and on implementing religious policies privileging the Orthodox Church, as well as assimilationist minority policies. So this kind of cultivation of nationalism really paid off for the regime back in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, and Putin's approval rating shot up to 90% as a result. So it was an event much celebrated by Russian nationalists from both left and right. To an extent, this emboldened Putin, paving the way for today's aggression. In recent years, other than touting Russian conservatism, the Putin regime has also embraced a self-image of being the protector of all ethnic Russians at home and abroad, and the guardian of Russian civilization, or the so-called Russian world. To be sure, not everyone buys into this vision in Russia. There are certainly lots of Russian people who are against this, but there is definitely a significant segment of the population, especially the older generation, that finds this vision appealing. Now, I've seen a series of recent public opinion surveys coming from Russia. I'm not saying that all those results were trustworthy, but they do show the same pattern, which is the older you are, the more likely you are to support this special operation. So I think this has a lot to do with the fact that the older generation had, personal experiences with the Soviet nation building, and therefore fully embraced this conflation of Russia and a sort of imperialistic identity. Therefore, the current Russian aggression should be understood within this broad historical context. So hopefully I stay within time limit.
Thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating background. And of course, it's the older generation that's calling the shots right now. Our next speaker will be Associate Professor Sergay from the Department of Russian Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And he will be speaking on competing narratives of Russia's post-Soviet development, their authors, their audiences.
Thank you, Professor Novkov. Thank you, Professor Chen, for that very brilliant historical overview of the development of today's very heady, intoxicating, and no doubt poisonous brew of ideas surrounding the idea of Russian imperial national identity. My own presentation will not be so well ordered. I would like to talk about what exactly we can do, first of all, as panelists, as researchers in this area. I don't have time to be very autobiographical, but I will say what I'm doing myself most of these days is immersing myself in the Russian language media sphere, mostly through YouTube, a little bit in Twitter, and I'm listening to what Russian commentators are saying in real time, and they are saying, as you can imagine, more than you could keep up with. There are commentators from various schools. There is the conflict intelligence team that was set up during the Ukraine events of 2013-2014. It was founded in 2015. There's all kinds of military and technical sidebars to develop. incident after incident after incident. As is typical for wars, the event generates a bewildering welter of detail, tactical detail, information about casualties, the war of propaganda. All of these things are impossible to subsume in a single perspective, and it is from this point that I want to begin my own presentation. There is no God's eye view of what is going on in Ukraine right now, and I certainly don't pretend to the teacher's edition. There is no teacher's edition of what's going on. If there were, I would be glad to read it out to you for 2 hours, but there is not. What there is, as is typical for both history and especially for war, there is a proliferation of narratives, which is why I've titled my presentation along those lines. Narratives of the events, their authors, their audiences. Even the drawing of historical analogies represents a kind of perspective. That is, personal perspectives is what we have to offer. We don't have absolute knowledge, but we have very strong opinions. I have terribly strong opinions about what is going on. I will try to keep my remarks as clean as I can. There is no point in insulting dogs. I will try to keep the vocabulary pure. Perspectives. The first one that I wanted to mention is the so-called Thucydides trap. There is a model for Putin's motivations for launching the attack on Ukraine that endorses some very famous remarks by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. Graham Allison, writing in the Financial Times in recent years, has developed that idea into a foreign policy concept, the Thucydides trap. What is that? It is the condition when one empire, one power grows fearful of the expansion and the increasing power of another. So the Peloponnesian War arises out of Sparta's fears of Athenian power, hence the Thucydides trap. If there's one thing that is clear from Russian propaganda about the cause of war, the casus belli in the current invasion, it is that the fault lies with the West, particularly with NATO, for expanding to the East. And because of the inclusion of the Baltic countries, the Partnership for Peace program initiated to give Georgia and Ukraine a distant prospect for joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at long length. Putin has made it clear that he cannot accept Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO because Ukraine belongs to our near abroad. Near abroad is a term by which in Russian politics one refers to the former Soviet republics, the peripheral Soviet republics, the 14 of them that have now that are now no longer part of the Russian Federation. My own thought, this was perhaps foolish, but this morning, instead of after I reviewed Thucydides, I was recalling Herodotus and Croesus, and I will share with you, colleagues, that I'm more partial to that narrative, that perspective on Putin's act of aggression. I see him now as Croesus. Croesus, you remember, was the king of Lydia. According to anecdotes, very famous anecdotes in Herodotus, he was not only wealthy, for which reason we say rich as Croesus, and I love the association of Putin, the famous kleptocrat, with the riches of Croesus. He is our modern Croesus, but also Croesus was, of course, the head of a great empire. When Croesus felt threatened by the expansion of Persia right up to Lydia's borders, and I thought, aha. History, of course, as it always does, it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes vaguely. And Croesus, according to Herodotus, asks the oracle whether he should invade, whether he should go to war. And the Pythia, the oracle, famously responds, if you go to war against Persia, you will destroy a great empire. Those who, like me, are appalled at the inhuman and internationally unconscionable illegal invasion of Ukraine, may take some heart at that. I do not. But such was the prophecy. If you go to war against Persia, you will destroy a great empire. Of course, he does go to war against Persia and discovers to his horror that the empire he destroys is his own and not the Persians. So even that is an example of a perspective. The terms of art here are not just right and wrong, accurate or inaccurate. The terms of art are narratives, perspectives, models, conceptual frameworks, theories of the case, schools of thought in foreign policy, oppositions, conceptual binaries. Context itself is a comparable term. That is what I hope that we panelists can offer. There's not time to narrate in 8 minutes the differences among a great many of those conceptual oppositions. The most important one, I think, is the one between liberalism in foreign policy thinking and so-called realism. It is the realist school associated most clearly with John Mearsheimer, which has been arguing that the present war is the fault of the West for breaking faith with early post-Soviet Russia and allowing NATO, despite some promises offered by James Baker in the 90s, not to advance NATO countries in exchange for Gorbachev allowing for the reunification of Germany. Despite those promises, NATO has indeed expanded. The typical response is that NATO has not so much expanded eastward as Russia's former neighbors have in terror and horror fled westward. I myself am partial to that perspective. It is the perspective that one associates with the political commentators who are sympathetic toward Alexei Navalny. If Putin, and I must end on this observation, this is my main through line, if Putin were truly concerned with limiting eastward expansion of NATO, all he had to do, in essence, was to adopt practices of domestic and foreign policy statecraft that are civilized and acceptable. Stop inspiring fear and terror in your neighbors by your kleptocratic tyranny at home and your expansionist aspirations abroad, and they will not flee for the nuclear umbrella of NATO. I'm simplifying in order to take, to the extent that I can, a bird's eye view, a synthesizing view of the entire problem. There are, as I say, there's a whole school of foreign policy thinking that is inclined to blame the West and invites us to blame ourselves for spurning the overtures of Russia in the early post-Soviet years toward greater comity, toward greater integration, even of Russia within the European community, even toward the inclusion of Russia within NATO itself. NATO responded to those overtures by affirming its procedures. First Yeltsin and then Putin take umbrage at that and take a different tack, a tack that we should associate with realpolitik, with realism. With that, I will conclude. I look forward to answering questions. In my safaris into the Russian media sphere, I have noted, as I say, many sidebars. I look forward to questions that may touch upon them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think we see from these first two presentations just how complex all of this is and the importance of not just looking at the foreign relations picture, but looking internally as well. Our final presenter is Professor of History, Nadia Kizenko. She's Professor of History and she's currently the Director of our Religious Studies program. And she will be speaking on Russian speakers and the Jews in Ukraine, their importance to Putin, and their role since 2014.
Thank you. February 2014 to February 2022 and February 24 onwards will be seen as new essential elements in forming Ukrainian identity, not least for Russian speakers and for Jews in Ukraine. But in fact, Ukrainian identity, identifying as Ukrainian, has been uniquely challenging over the centuries. It is a question many Americans can identify with. How do you survive as a nation when your nation no longer exists on the map? How do you survive as a nation when your nation has not existed on the maps of the world for centuries? How do you maintain a sense of nation, a sense of being a distinct people, when the nations and the peoples around you are dedicated to the principle that you do not even exist? Now, Ukrainians are not the only ones to have faced this challenge. After the big neighbors of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the end of the 18th century cut it up, Poland also disappeared from the maps of Europe. So did Belarus, so did Lithuania. After 1795, soon after the American colonies won their independence, we had a larger Russia, a larger Prussia, a larger Austria, but no Ukraine and no Poland. Ukrainian speakers found themselves divided among Russia and Austria and Hungary and later Czechoslovakia. The so-called Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, did not even appear with those names on the maps of Europe until after the First World War. They were part of Sweden or part of Russia. The Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Macedonians, all have been claimed by various neighbors, including the Ottoman Empire and Greece. So what does it take to make it as a nation when other nations pretend you don't exist? Putin is only the latest imperial neighbor to try that on Ukraine. And yet Ukraine persisted. How? Paradoxically, being carved up among different empires may have worked in Ukraine's favor. Although there were several different narratives about Ukrainian identity floating around, I would like to concentrate on two of them. One is the so-called the narrative from the so-called Velika Ukraina, or Central and Eastern Ukraine, and the other is the one most common among those who are from Western Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that is the safest right now, the part where the refugees from Kharkiv and Sumy and Zaporizhia go if they want to stay in Ukraine and not go to Poland and or Romania. That region, Halichina, home to the cities of Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, is distinct for many reasons. Paradoxically, despite its being a minority within Ukraine, despite its being long different from the majority of Ukraine, it nonetheless became key for articulating Ukrainian identity starting in the 19th century, continuing in the 20th century, and in the 21st century, especially after the Orange Revolution of 2005 and the Maidan Revolution of 2014. So what I'd like to do in the small amount of time remaining to me is to think about how a committed minority, combined with some spectacular external stimuli, such as the Russian invasion, can not only claim to, but come to speak for the nation as a whole, including such initially unpromising candidates for Ukrainian identity as Russian speakers and Jews. So as I've said, Ukrainian speakers found themselves in a number of different empires and started to identify with those empires. And the different empires developed different narratives. Many of the Ukrainians in the Russian Empire, for example, genuinely identified with the Russian imperial project, as my colleague, Professor Chen, suggested. And they could do this because they shared the same religion, along with Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the Ukrainians in Austria, for example, found it easy to reject the Russian imperial project. They were mostly not Orthodox, but Catholic, and they were exposed not to the Russian language, but to the German and Polish language. So the languages. So the Russian language spoken in different parts of Ukraine became slightly different, but mutually understandable, just as the German spoken by Germans and Austrians and Swiss is mutually understandable, but different. But these differences stopped mattering. In the 19th century, partly thanks to nationalism everywhere, partly because of ever more pressure against the Ukrainian language by the Russian imperial government, both Eastern and Western Ukrainians, both Orthodox and Catholics, started to find a common narrative based on the Ukrainian language and opposition to empire of any kind. In the meantime, Jews in Ukraine had a time of unique flourishing with the birth of charismatic movements like Hasidism. But this creative diversity did not get a chance to take hold because the experience of all these groups changed even more after World War I and the revolutions and civil wars and wars for independence of 1917 to 1921. Eastern and Central Ukrainians found themselves in the Soviet Union, where they endured the most devastating years of communism, including the Holodomor famine of 1932-33 and an assault on religious belief, especially Orthodox Christianity. Jews found themselves facing the Holocaust. Western Ukrainians, mostly but not only Catholics, found themselves in the newly independent Poland. And like the Croats and the Hungarians, they were in a position to take advantage of the chaos of the Second World War to fight for an independent nation, even if it meant working together with the Nazis. The Ukrainian nationalists were also the backbone of the anti-communist movement. After World War II, all these groups were in one Ukrainian SSR with special pressure on the Catholics to convert to Orthodoxy, even with official atheism. So even after independence in 1991, there were clear differences between Western Ukraine, like Lviv, and Eastern and Southern Ukraine, like Kharkiv or Odessa. These differences showed themselves in the Orange Revolution of 2005 and on election maps like those of 2010, with the West going for Yushchenko and the East and South for Yanukovych. However, even then, central Ukraine, including Kyiv, the capital, was more mixed. But all of that changed after 2014. Let me refresh your memory. In 2014, Yanukovych, the winner of the election, decided to flip towards an orientation towards Russia, not Europe. This enraged many Ukrainians as they had voted for him because he had said he would push toward Europe. They demonstrated in the Maidan Square of Kyiv. Many resistors were killed. And Putin's Russians and those who wanted to be allied to it tried to take over. In some parts of Ukraine, they succeeded. They got Crimea. They got Donetsk and Luhansk. Of course, it helped that the security forces and administration in those areas went over to Putin. But it only happened there. It did not happen in Kharkiv. It did not happen in Odessa. So in 2014, Putin's goal of seizing Russia from within collapsed. 2014 was the real turning point and the real wake-up call. After the loss and occupation of parts of Ukraine, even those parts that had been Russia-oriented understood the stakes. So did the Ukrainian government. Almost all the schools that once taught in Russian in Ukraine switched to Ukrainian, ditto movies and TV. The various religious denominations started to talk to one another in a vibrant council of religions, unlike anything in Russia or Belarus. Most crucially, in 2019, 73% of the Ukrainian population rejected a more narrow nationalism of Petro Poroshenko and voted instead for a far more inclusive notion of what it means to be Ukrainian. They voted for a Jewish comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, the hero of our time. So even before Putin invaded on February 24th, Ukraine was already a thriving, Western-oriented, diverse civic culture. They had united around creative diversity. Yes, some spoke Russian, some spoke Yiddish, but they could also speak Ukrainian. And in any case, the Ukrainian civic project had finally succeeded before the invasion of February 24th. Now, it's true that some people, some Ukrainians, like those in Kharkiv and Sumy, remained basically friendlily disposed to Russia. After all, they had long contributed to imperial culture, to Soviet culture, to the Red Army. But after February 24th, even that goodwill went up in smoke, literally. Professor Chen mentioned the Orthodox Church. I would like to note that after February 24th, many in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who had been in communion with Moscow have stopped commemorating Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, precisely because he supports Putin and the invasion. So even as Putin has tried to and is trying to destroy and fragment Ukraine, appealing to tropes like the Orthodox Church, he has done more to bring all Ukrainians together than many a more narrow national hero. Let us hope that Ukraine's open vision of the future and the Ukraine of Volodymyr Zelensky will triumph. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentations, a lot to think about. And I see we have many questions for our panelists, which I'm going to field for them. I'm just going to ask each of you to jump in as you feel this is relevant to what you know about Ukraine. Great to have such an interdisciplinary group of people who can cover so much territory here. Our first question from Farzin Sarg, how reliable are approval ratings and polling in general in Russia? Can these results ever be trusted for analysis?
Well, I think it all depends on who's doing the review, the survey, right? In general, you know, if a polling agency is funded by government, associated with the government, then, you know, needless to say, its results probably will be skewed. However, in general, you know, if it's a trustworthy, independent polling agency like the Nevada Center, which is generally considered rather trustworthy, then I'll say the results are rather reliable. And that's why, you know, in my talk, I didn't really cite the survey results because so far, in terms of approval rating for the special operation, that's so far, you know, what we have are from the agencies that are kind of affiliated with the government. So I'm not citing those. However, I do think the pattern that it demonstrates, which is that the older you are, the more likely you are to be supportive of the special operation. That actually fits what we know from the various Nevada Center surveys that shows the older generation usually has a much more pro-regime, pro-Putin, you know, pro-empire, pro-conservative types of view.
Great, thank you. Our next question from Matthew Bennett asks, how much, if at all, you all believe that the gas reserves in Ukraine had an impact on Putin's decisions?
Huh.
I actually don't think they had any. I think Russia has plenty of its own gas. I think Russia has plenty of its own natural resources. They had just finished building Nord Stream 2, which would have enabled Russia to funnel energy directly to Europe and especially to Germany, completely bypassing Ukraine. They didn't need the gas reserves in Ukraine. They needed Ukraine for other reasons connected to the imperial project. But I would say not for gas.
I would like to second that idea, and I would discourage the conclusion that, you know, as with the Gulf War, it's all about energy resources. It's all a fight for energy resources. I don't see that at all. There are energy resources in Ukraine, but the usual drama is that Russia is throttling its transfer of natural gas through its pipeline system to Ukraine and to Western Europe as a means of political economic blackmail or extortion. Russia does not Russia has more gas than it can sell, and in conditions of climate change, it will face the problem of what they call stranded resources. With any luck, they will be left with reserves for which there is no longer the brisk international market that has been supporting the kleptocratic regime.
Thank you. Samantha Simmons asks, how dangerous is it for surrounding countries to be taking in refugees?
If I might comment on this, I don't see that it is dangerous at all, frankly. These are mostly women and children arriving. The men who accompany their families mostly go back to Ukraine to continue the fight. I would argue that the European nation that has taken in the most refugees who are culturally different from places like Syria, Germany, has actually thrived with the refugees that it has taken in under Angela Merkel. So I'm not sure in what way these refugees would be a threat. I mean, do you mean in terms of economic resources? I mean, I'm actually genuinely curious about that question.
I just want to emphasize we are going to have additional panels where we might have people who can talk a little more about this, but please go ahead, Timothy.
It occurs to me that one avenue of danger that the questioner may be hypothesizing is potential Russian retaliation against those countries that harbor refugees from Ukraine. That is, do those countries risk the wrath of Putin? I'm kind of speculating. It's unfortunate that we can't have a rapid back and forth between the questioner and ourselves. But I would say the voices to which I've been listening have no fears about a dramatic expansion of Putin's war effort to surrounding countries, to NATO countries. It's clear that the problem already is that within Ukraine, his military resources are overextended. Their supply lines are failing. They are eating dry ration meals that are 7 years beyond their expiration dates. And the rumor is that Putin is begging President Xi of China for food for his troops. So this starving and undergassed, underfueled military machine is not likely to lash out against countries that accept flows of refugees. I'm just putting that out there.
So we have a couple of questions about NATO that I'm going to ask together. The first from Robert Howell asks about the extent to which we can look to NATO enlargement to blame for Putin's revanchism, or is it just a pretext? How can we look at this in the larger context of NATO expansion set against Russian reform and empire nostalgia? I think this ties in actually quite nicely with a question that Kevin Bronner asks about the Charter on Strategic Partnership between the U.S. and Ukraine, which asserted the U.S.'s support for NATO membership. Did that perhaps have an impact on where we are right now?
Well, in general, I would say from the Russian point of view, from Putin's point of view, and obviously this is one of the justifications that he came up with, when he talks about the invasion. NATO is posing a huge threat to Russia. And the fact that NATO keeps expanding eastward, during the past several decades is very alarming. In a sense, this is not something new exactly, because even back in the 1990s, Yeltsin was already strongly against NATO expansion. But that said, I just don't think that constitutes a real reason, for invading a sovereign country. So there is, I think, some kind of security concern there. Okay, there's going to be a military presence of NATO right next to the Russian border, and a lot of Russians do buy into this threat perception, but to what extent is NATO really threatening, in the sense that it's going to invade Russia? I think it's actually rather bogus.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Thank you. I think one of the things that should be discussed in the context of NATO is that it's easy to say, oh, NATO is only a defensive alliance. And so therefore, what kind of a threat could it be? But in fact, if one looks at Yugoslavia in the 1990s, NATO did go in, even though it wasn't a NATO country that was involved. So in other words, NATO, at least in one instance in the European experience, did, when faced with crimes against humanity, when faced with human rights violations and so on, NATO has shown that it's been willing to go in. Now, one might do the obvious rejoinder, which is to say, maybe if you don't do crimes against humanity and war crimes, NATO won't go in. I mean, I don't want to be an apologist for NATO, but simply I want to at least note that the sort of the whataboutism discussion almost invariably invokes Yugoslavia. So I thought that I should just put that on the table.
I would, if I may, I would like to join the discussion at this point, and I would say this, Professor Kizenko's point that the defensive model of NATO underwent a considerable modification thanks to the Kosovo intervention is an important one. This was not lost on foreign policy thinkers in Russia either. As you've heard, I am not sympathetic to the idea that the Ukraine crisis is the fault of the West. It is not the fault of the West, and in hand-wringing by Western thinkers, we are in a way playing into, one hates to say it, we're playing into favorite and very old Kremlin talking points. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing real to the issue. NATO has indeed expanded eastward. There was undoubtedly clumsiness and regrettable promises about non-expansion in the 1990s. James Baker's memoirs were falsified at one point. He eventually comes clear and says, yes, I got out over my skis. He himself tried to walk back his initial very generous promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if only Gorbachev would accept without violence the reunification of Germany in 1989/90. Okay, fine, but what I have to insist on is that even in Putin's initial speech, he was not laying great emphasis on the expansion of NATO. It was all about denazification. NATO did not create a Nazi regime in Ukraine, and the two do not even relate logically. And here I must invoke the idea that what the Russian propaganda machine is great at doing is generating a proliferation of theories of the case, whatever the case may be, none of which, no two of which need necessarily be logically, empirically compatible. It doesn't matter. I call it the fake launcher machine. Instead of grenade launchers, the propaganda apparatus just launches many of theories of the case. Why was the Malaysian flight MH17 downed in 2014 in July? Immediately we saw many conflicting theories. It was a Ukrainian fighter jet. No, it was a missile attack. No, they thought it was Putin of taking a planned journey of his own, and they were aiming to bring down Putin's plane, etc., etc. None of it made any sense at all. The whole point of Russia's information policy is to keep all of us scratching our heads, and with any luck, blaming ourselves. I want to just let me quote Stephen Kotkin's recent article in the Times Literary Supplement of March 11. He addresses this issue. He writes, NATO expansion did not cause Putin's regime to jail or murder journalists and opposition figures, seize and manipulate domestic media, loot state funds on an unfathomable scale, or conflate the country's survival with that of his personal rule, any more than a defensive alliance of mostly pacifist nations, many of which spent little on their militaries until Putin galvanized them, threatened the security of Russia. But the fallacy of portraying the Kremlin's familiar recourse to autocracy, repression, militarism, and suspicion of foreigners as somehow a reaction to Western actions has a long history, and Kotkin proceeded to review that history.
All right, thank you. As a political scientist, the next question from Ingmang Wang is near and dear to my heart. asking our panelists for a broadly comparative perspective. Is there an analogy between the current war and possible tensions between China and Taiwan or other types of similar dynamics?
Okay, well, obviously, the issue of Taiwan's received a lot of attention these days because lots of people see potential parallels. I think it's very interesting to see that the Chinese government so far has been having a really ambiguous attitude toward all this. On the one hand, there is this boilerplate emphasis on sovereignty. We want peace, we don't want war. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese government is also trying to not draw any parallels between the Ukraine situation and the Taiwanese issue because from the Chinese point of view, and the official point of view, Taiwan is not Ukraine because Taiwan is not recognized as a sovereign country. So from the regime's point of view, right, there's no parallel because whatever China is going to do regarding Taiwan is going to be an internal issue. It's basically an unresolved civil war. So in that sense, the Chinese government is not, it's definitely not trying to make any connection there. But of course, from the Western point of view, right, there are definitely similarities there. We're seeing a country that's basically pro-Western and clearly, has the potential of being invaded by a major power that's not so pro-Western. So in that sense, I do think there is a lot of, concerns, whether this is going to evolve in the same way as, what we're seeing today in Ukraine. My sense is that right now it's just really hard to tell. China, of course, I just don't see any possibility of the Chinese regime giving up on Taiwan like ever. But to what extent China is willing to resort to force, I think will be shaped by the result of this war. Whether Russia will be able to crush the Ukrainian resistance, whether Russia's economy and its political system will be able to survive the Western sanction, I think all these scenarios are going to send a message to Beijing that they will have to pay attention to.
Thank you. So, Mearsheimer, right or wrong, are leaders of countries in the region, especially in the Baltics and even Moldova, right to be concerned about Putin's ambitions here? And if so, what current political or economic factors might play into Putin's decision-making? This is directed at Tim, but obviously it's open to anybody who wants to take a stab at it.
Thank you for that question. I have been teaching the seminal article by John Mearsheimer on this very point. It dates to the 2014 Ukraine crisis. Let us call it Ukraine crisis 1.0. It appeared in Foreign Affairs like many seminal landmark articles, and it was called Ukraine is the West's Fault. I warmly recommend all the audience take an interest in that article. Foreign Affairs has dusted it off and redistributed it in emails to subscribers. In the next issue of Foreign Affairs, there were very substantive rebuttals from the liberal perspective by Ambassador McFaul and the Russian specialist Steven Sestanovich. They point out such facts as under Yeltsin, and indeed for the longest time in the 22 years of Putin's reign, the whole topic of NATO eastward expansion was not a hot button topic in Russian political discourse. It seemed to be a simmering and often forgotten issue. There's the whole prospect of, there's the example of the Baltic states, which are within a stone's throw of Petersburg, and the fact that they are NATO states does not seem to strike mortal fear into the hearts of the Kremlin masters. So there's a lot to say about whether Mearsheimer is right or wrong. I think what will enter the foreign policy decision making of Putin, should his deplorable regime continue to exist and entertain further military adventures, what will enter it is the fantastic and unexpected unity of the West in opposing the military aggression, the unexpectedly ferocious sanctions campaign, ferocious enough, according to my Russian sources, even to give China pause, as Professor Chen was alluding to a moment ago. Those things will enter into Putin's calculus, such as it is. A lot of the argument in the Russian media sphere is over whether Putin has cognitively jumped the tracks, so to speak. Is he in his right mind? Or are we seeing the senility set in and only become stronger? That is one of the cliches in which Putin's opponents talk about his mental state. So Mearsheimer is right and wrong. I'm listening to what he is saying in very recent interviews, and he speaks with sorrow about the present Ukrainian situation. He has not retracted his basic point. He still regards it as a consequence of NATO expansion. And in his view, might makes right. He invokes that very formulation. He is, as we say, he is the dean of realist thinkers in foreign policy. Might does make right. You cannot appeal to ideas like the rights of nations to self-determination, to democracy. None of that works at the level of international relations. There, the law of the jungle continues to obtain.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions. One that I'm sure is on many people's minds, but from Ryan Irwin. We're more than a month into this war. For all three of you, what has been the biggest surprise to you? Or did you see absolutely everything unfolding exactly as it has?
In fact, almost everything about this war has been a big surprise to me, from the fact that it started, because neither I nor anyone else that I talked to really believed up until the last minute that it would happen. I also, I mean, that my area of surprise is probably more niche than those of my colleagues, but I must say I found myself very surprised the degree to which even the previously Moscow-leaning part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in regions of Eastern Ukraine like Kharkiv and Sumy, which I knew best, that it took the invasion to shake the idea that really had been entrenched of a larger all-Rus identity. So people, church hierarchs who I didn't think were capable of calling Russia the aggressor by name, calling Putin the aggressor by name, stopping to commemorate the patriarch. In the circles that I run in, that's quite huge.
Professor Chen, please go on. I've been dominating the airwaves, please.
I think you were that bad. So go ahead if you really want to say something.
All right. I will say it. First Soviet and now Russian history is always surprising the Kremlin watchers. The collapse of the Soviet Union itself generated a whole cottage industry of articles and books about how we got Russia wrong, how the community of Kremlinologists failed to see it coming, where except for a few prophetic voices in the 1980s who wrote books with titles like "Will the Soviet Union exist until the year whatever it was, 1980?" I forget what the year was. Amalric was his name. So yes, I was surprised because he went in. The invasion itself, February 24th, plunged me into a state of astonishment from which I have physically not recovered. It has murdered sleep, this war. I am spending, as I say, my waking hours to the extent possible in my video feed. I was telling my friends that the fact that Russia had moved significant supplies of blood and blood products to its troops massed at the borders of Ukraine, that was a theatrical flourish. It was still a bluff, but a bluff carried out with such production values as Hollywood would envy. This was just a professional, and I was completely wrong. They moved the blood products because they intended to invade Ukraine. It was all real, and of course now it seems obvious that you don't mass all of those troops. But of course our surprise was prepared for by the unending flow of lies from the Kremlin, from Putin himself, about his intentions. about, of course we're not going in. Who could even, there was snarkiness on RT, there was snarkiness in the Russian news broadcasts. How could those suspicious Westerners think that we could possibly invade a country? All of that is, of course, now forgotten in the official Kremlin news cycles.
Well, I'm just going to be really brief. I just like Nadia, I was also surprised by the fact that the invasion actually took place. I saw it was mostly posturing, but I do think Russia, I mean, the Putin regime already knew that he was going to get sanctioned big time, and he still did it. I think that for me was the biggest shock.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our wonderful panel for their brilliant insights. I've learned so much. But this is not our last opportunity to learn. Please keep an eye out for announcements of upcoming events, which we are organizing right now. And thank you all so much.